Well, well, I was going to say now I crawl under the table after that wonderful introduction. But I wanted to say how truly delighted I am to be speaking to you today, your time. And thanks so much, Tobias and Matt, for organizing this lecture series, which, as you must know, is the first of its kind. So I never thought we'd be this far along at this time, by this time. So this is very exciting and very gratifying. Thank you very much. So what I'm going to be talking to you about is a concept that was very influential in the 20th century called the ghost in the machine. And I'm going to explain how it became an obstacle to understanding cognition, and then how basal cognition arose in part out of that. Now, some of you would have read the article that was distributed for this talk and before this talk, and we're going to be approaching the subject from a slightly different trajectory. We'll end up in the same place, but it's going to be argued differently. Okay, so first what I want to do is I want to give you the take-home messages. I will remind you of them at the end, but the idea is for you to see how what is said during the talk actually either cashes out what I'm promising here. You know, do I provide the are these just promissory notes, or do I actually give value for what I'm promising, or whether I'm not? So the first point is that life really isn't possible without processes traditionally considered cognitive, and that means cognitive in animals such as ourselves. Now, this should not be a big deal. Maturana and Varela already demonstrated this with their theory of autopoiesis, and that theory has never been analyzed in detail and refuted. Nobody has ever said, this is not true, this is not right. People will skirt all around them for all kinds of other reasons, but it's like Berkeley's argument for idealism. It's a huge inconvenience, but nobody's ever actually refuted it that I know of. But I don't follow this philosophical literature all that closely, so maybe somebody has by now. The third point is, why is this important? And even though I'm arguing against an anthropogenic view of cognition, you cannot get away from the fact that we all want to know what makes us different. Now, every living thing on the planet, every species, every phylum, they're all different from all the others. I mean, they have similarities, but they have differences. But we will never understand the ways in which we ourselves are different from other living things in this part of our experience that is so important to us until we understand what's happening in the rest of the living world. That's my point, and I'm sticking to it. Okay, in this talk, I'm going to provide you with two things, I hope. The first one are some historical reasons that it's been so hard to get a handle on cognition, and that is the ghost. And the second thing I hope to provide you with is a bit of a tasting plate of some bacterial behaviors that suggest that they're driven by capacities. Those behaviors are driven by capacities recognized as cognitive in animals. Okay, so what is the ghost we're talking about? The ghost was, the ghost in the machine was a phrase, very, very nifty phrase, introduced by Gilbert Ryle, who was an English philosopher, very, very influential. He was the editor of the by that time, almost a century-old journal, Mind, which after his editorship was never quite the same again, and not in a good way, but there you go. That's my view. But Ryle was basically pointing directly at René Descartes. And that all becomes very clear when he explains what he considers to be the dogma of the ghost in the machine. Now, the dogma of the ghost in the machine is both a professionally held view by philosophers, but also a widely held view by lay people. And that is that there is that mind-body dualism, that there's something different between the body and the mind that makes us think of a mind over and above the body. Now, this appears to be the default view, and you will find it in many, many, many cultures around the world. So I think there is something to it. And Ryle's program is to basically drive a stake through this. Now, his two main lines of attack on the dogma, neither of which are particularly convincing in my view, are one is, the first is linguistic or logical, and he describes this as describing mental categories as a category mistake. And he says this because bodies are physical, they are made of matter, they have extension, they're observable, and they're public. And mental things are immaterial, unobservable, and private. And therefore they occupy different kinds of reality. Now, he never says what reality is. He just assumes that we all know what reality is. But he says they occupy different spaces in the reality that we experience. And therefore, to conflate the mental with the physical, because he is a physicalist, he is a materialist, that it's just illogical in the extreme. I'm not arguing either point here. I'm just saying this is partly how we got into the mess we're in. He uses examples such as a university, like I'm a visitor to Bochum. I say, I'd really like to see the university. And so Tobias takes me around and he says, here are classrooms, here are lecture halls, here are our laboratories, here are our administration buildings, here are our students, here are our staff. And then I, as a naive visitor, say, yeah, that's all good, but where's the university? Like, the university is over and above the description of all the parts, okay? I think this is a bad argument myself. I think this is a bad argument, but it held water for quite some time. All that does is tell you how we deploy ordinary language. And at the time that Ryle was writing, Wittgenstein had not yet written philosophical investigations, so he didn't have the benefit of those discussions to help him or demolish his argument. I don't know. And he also used a scientific argument based on behaviorism, that there was no need to postulate mind over and above bodily behavior. Now, at the time he wrote, 1949, the cognitive revolution was not even on the horizon as yet. That would come in the middle of the 1950s. So behaviorism ruled the roost. But Ryle's view mainly was that he wanted to get rid of this. He wanted to drive a stake once and for all in the notion of dualism. And the reason why he did this is because of vitalism, which was considered a source of superstition. It was the thing that gave religion legs. and it allowed people to believe in ghosts, and all of that was anti-scientific. So this was a philosophical program that was trying to get rid of all these beliefs that human beings have had for a very, very long time, and put us all on an adequate scientific footing. At the time, there was a battle going on for the soul of biology between what were then called vitalists and mechanists. Now, the vitalists thought that life is different, and that you can't just look at physics and chemistry and hope to get an explanation of what's happening with life. The vitalists thought that self-organizing, developing systems required new kinds of explanation. This was their dominant position, actually, more than anything else. This was their dominant position, while the mechanists thought reductionism works, physics and chemistry works, and complexity will ultimately yield to those to probing by those disciplines. And finally, the vitalists were arguing that being a methodological or an epistemological vitalist is not the same as believing in a vital force that animates matter. That you can believe that methodologically you need new tools, and epistemologically you're going to need explanations without believing in a metaphysical entity. And the mechanists were saying, as they still say, that physics and chemistry, those processes are the furniture of the world, and there is nothing over and above them. Like I said, I'm not going to come down on either side. I'm just going to, later on in this talk, we'll take stock of where each of these positions is. Okay, what Ryle forgot about Descartes is that the machine view of life entirely arises from Cartesian dualism. And Cartesian dualism importantly said that only humans have mental lives, and the rest of the living world is mindless and machine-like. Now, the embrace of this idea that the rest of the living world is mindless and machine-like led us to believe that we could led people like Richard Dawkins to postulate of genes and other things that they are selfish. And because he thought everybody knows this is just a way of talking, all of that stuff is just machine-like. We might be talking in that way, but we're on okay ground. But by using mind language to describe something believed to be machine-like, basically led us in a completely wrong direction, in my view, for 4 decades, something like that, at any rate. Okay, so subtracting mind only leaves the machine, and it raises problems for naturalizing the mind. Now, many of you may not know what this program of naturalizing the mind is, because in the 21st century, we don't need to do it anymore. But in the latter 20th century, it was really important. And the reason why it was important was because everyone forgot that we're always forgetting. Everyone forgot that Galileo had made a methodological choice when he said, in my new science of the physical, I'm going to bracket all organic bodies, all their sensory apparatus, anything relating to mind, anything relating to behavior. He didn't bracket these because he didn't think they were subjects fit for science. They just weren't subjects fit for the science he wanted to develop. And because he was already going to have trouble with the Inquisition, just with the physical, with physics, he probably made exactly the right decision. But we all forgot that he made this decision. So in the mid-20th century, there was this almost like a moral panic about trying to fit the mind and cognition into the natural sciences, which would not have been necessary if we had remembered that Galileo made a methodological decision and that mind was somehow outside of the bounds of natural science. So, and this, needless to say, raises problems for explaining cognition. And one of Ryle's students, who spent the greater part of the latter 20th century and all of his life up until this moment, basically trying to drive a stake through vitalism, is Daniel Dennett. Okay, so what everybody forgot about categories. Ryle's idea of a category mistake was believed to be something that was could be rescued from his argument. And category mistakes were very, very popular in the 60s, the 70s, and for part of the 80s when they finally moved into European philosophy and started to infect it. But what we forget is that categories are not reality, that the map is not the territory. We have to keep saying this over and over because everybody forgets it all the time. We say things like we are carving nature at the joints, but we forget that the metaphor is based on extracting meat efficiently for human consumption. This should tell us something. It means that categories exist to serve human epistemic needs. So no joints as joints exist in nature independent of evolutionary context and epistemic need. You cannot explain a joint separate from a limb, separate from a hand or a foot, separate from the next thing that it's connected to. It's something we take out and say, this is real, but it's only real in a context. And we forget about that. And we forget it at our peril. So, meanwhile, over in Australia, a student in Asian studies at the Australian National University was trying to get a handle on her PhD topic, which was supposed to be a cross-cultural philosophical comparison of 4 Buddhist propositions. But the closer she looked at these propositions, the more she realized they contain all these mind-like concepts, so that all required a comparator on the Western side. There were all these things that could be drawn on from the Buddhist side, but it was unclear what the comparator was on the Western side. So what I did was I read a hell of a lot of books on the philosophy of mind, cognitive science, neuroscience, etc. And at the time, remember, this is in the late 1990s, early 2000s. What I found was that cognition had something to do with computation, had something to do with representation. It was believed to be like a Turing machine, that it had logic gates and cognitive maps and schemas and scripts, and the computational architecture was somehow important. And there was a functionalism that was considered substrate neutral. What in the hell does that mean? And that cognition had something to do with intentionality, which was a medieval concept that was resurrected in the 19th century, had to do with aboutness. And Dennett said, everybody don't get worried about everything looking like it. It has intentionality. We can talk about things as though they have intentionality without buying into their intentionality at all. And in this, he included all kinds of biological systems. There was, and the thing that I found most egregious of all of it was the fact that thought experiments were privileged in a way that I just didn't understand. I mean, they were nothing like, Einstein's thought experiments. They were, you could think up almost anything, and people would ask you to understand their intuitions, many of which I could never understand. But I came to realize that the common denominator of all of them was an anthropogenic approach, which is the human. It begins in the human case, which made me raise the question of where is evolution and biology in all this. And at the time that I was coming into the field, embodied cognition had not taken off the way it has now. It wasn't until 2001 that an argument was made to cognitive scientists that they should pay attention to animals at all. I mean, really, can you believe it? I can barely believe it myself anymore. And what I found was that there were very few constraints on theorizing, and there were many false positives. Some people thought that thermostats could be might be in danger of being called cognitive. Guided missiles might be in danger that way. That, how did we, were robots included in this? Was the Watt governor on the steam engine representing things? And so there were endless debates about where cognition lies. But if you tried to suggest that it might be in simple biological organisms, that was out of the question. Okay, so in the weird view, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic view, mind and cognition were undefined. The brain was what it is. What it does was computation over representations. It processed information. It did things like sense, remember, learn, make decisions, and it implemented movement and behavior. But if you were looking for identifying criteria about where you would find it in the natural world, you were stuck with human or similar, and all those were disputed, and so there were effectively none. So I had no comparator, so basically the comparative project had to be abandoned. And what I decided instead was to decide how we had gotten in this mess and how we might be able to get out of it. So I put all of the cognitive stuff, science stuff to the side, and I went and read a lot of books on biology and read a lot of biological approaches to cognition. And the constraints that came out of this were much, much, much more satisfying. Autopoiesis, thermodynamics, evolution, ecology, adaptation. It was really clear that cognition had something to do with all of those things. Homeostasis and development seemed to be more borderline cases, but they all had a sort of like a cognitive flavor about them. Dennett might have been right about the intentional stance here, but there they were. Biological functions were multi-level, and they couldn't just be instantiated in any old thing. And so it involved real organism behavior, inheritance, existential goals, continuity, and novelty in evolution. So the common denominator it started in biological principles, and it created really hard constraints on theorizing. I called this the biogenic approach. And by the way, they are not mutually exclusive. You can take a biogenic approach to biological cognition, and you can take a biogenic approach to human cognition. They're not mutually exclusive. They just have different starting points. Here is a list of some biogenic principles. Obviously, I'm not going to read this out. You're not going to be able to read all of it. If you want me to send you the slide, I can. It does appear in other places in my work. But all of these are hard constraints on theorizing, which is why thought experiments are not very useful unless you can build in all these things. Okay, so out of this fossicking, I came to 3 basic facts of life, which are going to sound really but they became the framework around which everything else came and formed. And that's that Biological systems are dynamically self-preserving. They engage in action to facilitate their growth and well-being, and they engage in action to facilitate their reproduction. And I can guarantee you there is no known non-organic self-organizing autocatalytic system on the planet that we know of right this moment that can do any of that. Okay, so now I'm going to run through a logic of cognition based on the facts of life. And I'm really sorry if this is more well duh. I was told that there aren't any biologists in your midst, so I'm trying to make sure that the main messages get home, but I will go through this pretty quickly. Premise one is self-preservation, and that means that basically that organisms have to maintain themselves far from thermodynamic equilibrium by bringing in matter and energy from their surroundings, transforming it into something something they can use, and then to sustain the system, and then exporting disorder in the form of waste. The premise two is interaction, which refers to the causal relations that the organism has to establish with its environment that lead to exchanges of matter and energy. Third is autopoiesis, which is self-production. I think many of you know what this is about, but I will just give you an example of if a jumbo jet, if a jet airliner was autopoietic, it would be mining the materials, it would be obtaining the materials for all of the components that go into the plane, manufacturing the components, fixing them in networks, and flying all at the same time. This is an amazing thing that living things do. It is a very, very weird thing that living things do. It only seems normal because we're surrounded by it. But if you come from a world in which physics and chemistry are the furniture of the world, you can't get to autopoiesis from there. In my view, you just can't. Okay. So control organisms are constituted by a wide variety of control mechanisms with multiple kinds of feedback that will ensure system persistence. That in order to persist, they have to continually alter their internal structure or their interactive relation to features of their surroundings, which we call adaptation. And that they are any situation that stimulates an organism to alter its structure or behavior conveys information for that organism. In Bateson's sense, it is the difference that makes a difference. Okay, now, given these premises, one thing becomes absolutely clear. You need a system of external monitoring. What also becomes clear is that you need a system of internal monitoring to determine the level of functioning relative to continued autopoiesis. Third, in order to persist, information from the external monitoring system and internal monitoring systems have to be integrated. They have to be brought together in a way that makes sense to the system. In order to do that, that means they have to value what's happening to them. They have to place a value on what they're experiencing as acceptable, advantageous, or dangerous. This is what is at the heart of valence. So there is an intrinsic subjectivity to all organismal life because valence is always a projection of value. It has a perspective. What is acceptable to me is not what is acceptable to a C. elegans, is not advantageous to a Bacillus subtilis, is possibly dangerous to a protist. You know, we all have different requirements, and that perspective and that projection of value can be subject to error, is subject to error. And because it's subject to error, we have to have a means of detecting error and ascertaining the failure of an adaptation. In order to do this, it does seem as though all living things require a cognitive toolkit or a suite of capacities in order to stay alive that we normally consider cognitive in human beings. And that because living systems are endogenously active, they are not passive stimulus response systems. It is temporal, they all are temporally future oriented. So many systems at many levels that contribute to organism fitness will be anticipatory. Okay, so from all this, I developed, this is a more developed version of a working definition, but this is basically how I started. And that is that cognition comprises the sensory and other information processing mechanisms an organism has for becoming familiar with, valuing, and interacting productively with features of its environment, which I put in brackets, exploring, exploiting, and evading aspects of that environment in order to meet existential needs, including survival, growth, and reproduction. So the question then is, okay, if this is the evidence that produces the logic, that produces a definition, what does the evidence actually bear out the logic? So I went straight to the bottom. Viruses are down there, but I don't know what their status is really. So I went to look at bacteria to see what was happening there. And to cut a long story short, I found every single one of these capacities that you see here, all of those and multiples of them can all be found in prokaryotes, in bacteria. I don't look at archaea much because we don't know that much about archaea yet, but what's coming up in archaea bears this out as well. And my definition of the functions you will see are very, very basic. They are, because they're found in bacteria, I have tried to make them as phyletically neutral as possible. Nobody's rushing to take up these definitions, but the cognitive toolkit is there. So what you find right off the bat is if you start looking at prokaryotes, you will see that they have extraordinary capacities for computing with protein chemistry. And the following quote is one that came from Sterling and Laughlin's wonderful book on the principles of neural design. And I have another talk that I gave a lot this past summer on the principles of neural design without neurons. And so there's a much larger account that goes with this. I'm hoping to write a paper about that in the next couple of months. But in talking about computing with protein chemistry, they make this observation. I have to take some of it with, I have to take their word for it because I don't understand how these procedures used in analog electronics are implemented in physical systems. So I have to take their word for it. But simple chemical circuits can amplify, oscillate, differentiate, and integrate. There's plenty of evidence for that, as well as taking logs and raising to powers. Chemical circuits support the arithmetic operations add, subtract, multiply, and divide. Small chemical circuits also have the ability to perform more complicated functions. And certainly I'm going to show you a few more complicated functions right now. So one of the things that has become really clear in bacteria that move via flagella is they almost all of them, everyone that has been found so far, has a large chemoreceptor array at the leading pole of the cell. You can see it here, this dark thing. And over here, I can't see this very well because my picture is in front of it. But these have been tagged fluorescently and can be seen in the other images shown here. And this is a highly conserved architecture for receiving and integrating signals from the surrounding milieu. They are composed of several thousand chemoreceptor proteins, and they operate as networks. Network activity is found in other signal transduction pathways, but not with this sort of dedicated and costly protein infrastructure. It's the cost of the infrastructure that makes some researchers, and certainly me, think that something else might be going on other than just moving the cell around. These protein arrays, each one of the receptors, the chemoreceptors, in this protein array of tens of thousands are themselves very complex. You see that they're each half of this chemoreceptor is made up of 3 pairs. Each of these pairs has 4 on each side, or 8 in each pair, 8 sites on which they can be altered, methylated, phosphorylated, in this case, methylated. So if you've got 12 on each side, let's see, no, that's 8. Sorry, I'm going by 8s here. That's 24. That's 48 sites. That's 48 sites on one chemoreceptor. And that chemoreceptor feeds into another structure that is comprised of trimers again, which feed into the chemosensory array. And you'll see that it is believed that the chemosensory array, which has not been imaged that closely yet because we don't have the resolution for it, it is believed that it uses principles very similar to those in beehives. Okay, so that's chemotaxis. That's sensing in bacteria. Okay, there's also electrical signaling in bacteria. There are ion channels in bacteria, and it was a potassium ion channel in Streptomyces lividans, which led to the 2003 Nobel Prize to Roderick McKinnon for elucidating in glorious detail the structure and mechanism of ion channels as proposed by Hodgkin and Huxley. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful work. But at the time, no one knew what ion channels were doing in bacteria. None. This was in, from 89 to 99, and then up until 2015, when a couple of articles were published showing that ion channels in Bacillus subtilis biofilms have the same function as neurons, and that is ion channels in neurons, and that is to signal rapidly over long distances and large numbers of cells without hitting every cell, affecting every cell along the way. It's like a straight signal from here to here. Okay, the people who discovered this were two groups who exemplify to my mind, best practice in empirical experimental design and computational modeling. Amazing, amazing work. Gurel-Suel at UCSD, both of them are Spaniards. He is the one who principally designs the experiments and runs them, and Jordi Garcia-Ojalvo, who is a lovely human being, is the numbers man, and boy, is he good. At any rate, okay. I will leave you with this thought that the leading mechanism for investigating anesthesia, which remains a mystery to this day, is a bacterial voltage-gated sodium channel found in 2008. So here's an example of how electrical signaling operates in B subtilis biofilms. So here you have a happy biofilm growing away. All of the cells on the edges are breaking open the cell walls of other bacteria, eating and reproducing. But at some point, the cells in the center of the biofilm start to starve. And when they start to starve, they send out a signal that they induce potassium release that leads to depolarization of the neighboring cells, which then causes the cells at the periphery to stop eating and letting the nutrients diffuse back to the center so that the cells in the center can be fed. Now, this is weird enough, but this mechanism has also been shown to work between biofilms where there are declining nutrients. So basically, the two biofilms timeshare eating and feeding, while the other one remains quiescent, and then they stop and let the other biofilm feed, which I don't even know how we explain that in evolutionary terms at this point, because not all of them are clones. And this is, it's really interesting, but it's also interesting that electrical signaling has now been found to play an important part in the germination of spores. And how bacterial spores germinate has long been a mystery. Okay, so anticipatory processes. We're going to be talking about predictive regulatory networks in E. coli. Okay, we start here with an E. coli that infects some prawns or shrimp, depending upon where you come from. That prawn cocktail is eaten by a human. And as soon as the bacteria enter the mouth, the temperature goes up. So heat shock proteins and other stress responses related to heat are triggered. And because in evolutionary terms, the bacteria know that oxygen levels are going to start to drop, they immediately start to switch to anaerobic respiration. Okay, so temperature goes down, oxygen levels drop. These two responses are dissociable. They are through conditioning, the temporal sequence can be reversed. Now the people who did this, Tagopoulos and his group, which did some brilliant work, they all thought this was an indication of learning. Now, I would only say that this is an indication of epigenetic learning, that somehow this experience was pinned for a period of time in the organisms, such that the knowledge could be embedded in the genome or in expression patterns of genes in some way. I don't think we can say until actual experiments are done on bacteria that expressly are looking for learning other than habituation and sensitization. I don't think we can say that. But what we can say is that there is now really compelling evidence that amoeba are capable of associative conditioning. And this is, this is kind of a blockbuster that nobody's heard of. And there was a pilot study that was done, and when it was successful, this was done in these experiments were carried out in 5 labs involving 9 academic entities in 3 countries, Spain, Israel, and Russia. And there were 4 reviewers on this article. So this has been looked at, really, really, really closely. And what was found is, I just think these experiments are amazing, because the most important thing to remember here is that there were 2,000 free living cells that were tracked individually. Each cell tracked individually. They were individually tested for their reaction to an electric field. Then they were washed and rested and allowed to sort of like chill until they were exposed to a chemotactic peptide to see how they responded to that. The peptide was a molecular signal of prey bacteria, so they had all of the responses to that. Then there was an induction protocol where there was simultaneous presentation of the electric field with the chemotactic peptide on the anode side, the end that you will see in a moment, the amoeba really, really didn't like at all. And then there was a conditioning test of the electric field without the chemotactic peptide. It was just the field, no chemotactic peptide. And each of these cells, and there were 3 species that were compared. They looked at their response intensity, the directionality, their persistence, the distance they traveled, the direction, and their average speed. All of these things were measured. And this is what they found. In the unconditioned cells with galvanotaxis, you see in all three species of amoeba, and these were all free living amoeba. None of them were laboratory specimens. None of them had been conditioned by laboratory use. That's one of the things I find absolutely amazing about this, is that 96%, 97%, 94% are all going to the cathode. They're all going to the negative end. Okay, after conditioning, you've got, and remember, this is conditioning with an electric, with the chemotactic peptide on the anode, which over here they're avoiding. And so here you have all 3 species again, 75%, 82%, 79% going to the anode without the peptide. This is not epigenetic learning. This is learning in one lifetime in a single-celled creature. This is bizarre. This is going to have to be repeated and repeated and repeated before people take it seriously. But it does look as though there are certain cognitive capacities that are very much present in very, very simple organisms. So that brings us to basal cognition. The aim of basal cognition as a research program is to see whether, as per Darwin, an evolutionary continuum of cognitive function exists. Does it or doesn't it? To what extent it does exist and how it's implemented. So basal refers to the models of study, bacteria, Physarum, Dictyostelium, Trichoplax, which is the simplest animal, which like sponges have no neurons. So we're looking at aneural organisms, unicellular plants, and animals without nervous systems, animals with very simple nervous systems, hydroworms, larval stages, of various organisms, and intra-organism systems like cells, tissues, the immune system, development and regeneration. So basal cognition is not a kind of cognition. It is the study in basal models of capacities, functions that are considered cognitive in more complex systems. So you're looking at memory, you're looking at sensing, you're looking at the mechanisms of sensing, you're looking at learning, you're looking at problem decision making under uncertainty, and in particular when there's conflicting stimuli. Because even in bacteria, it's not additive, it's nonlinear. So we really don't know what's going on. So who's winning the battle now? The vitalists are no longer called vitalists, they're called organicists. And they have demonstrated quite clearly that life is different and that self-organizing developing systems require new kinds of explanation. That you can be a methodological and epistemological organicist without believing in a vital force. On the mechanist side, who are now patently called what they are, which is physicalist, it is now clear that the belief that that life is only physics and chemistry is that it's a belief. It also means that reduction doesn't work, and linkage to physical and chemical processes doesn't work without new concepts and tools, at the very least with the dynamical systems theory. And again, on the last one, that physical and chemical processes are the only real furniture of the world. Again, that's a belief. It is not an established fact. That's somebody placing a bet on where everything's going to wash up when all is said and done. It's not a statement of fact. Okay, so Gilbert Ryle was not the only person who wrote about the ghost in the machine. And this is going to seem like a bit of a curveball, and I admit it is. And I'm going to draw your attention to something that Arthur Koestler wrote, which is a very, very different book from Gilbert Ryle's, and was intended as a corrective to Ryle. A true science of life must let infinity in and never loses sight of this. The great innovators in the history of science have always been aware of the transparency of phenomena towards a different order of reality. I don't know if that's underneath one of these pictures, so I don't know if it's reality or existence. My memory's not that great because I haven't got that much estrogen anymore. At any rate, the ubiquitous presence of the ghost in the machine. Now, what on earth does this mean? The first thing it means, why is this here? And why can't I read anything? Okay, there we go. The first thing it means is that life tends toward complexity and integration in a way that non-life does not. And it exhibits adaptive plasticity whose limit we do not yet know. Second, boy, I'm having trouble at this end. Organisms are not dualities of body and mind. They are hierarchies of interdependent subsystems, which are both parts and wholes, with some individuality within their wholeness or directedness in their processes. So there are, this basically supports Michael Levin's view of tissue, cognition in tissues, cognition in cells at a part level in bodies. That physicists of the 20th century had difficulty coming to terms with the quantum world, but now we work with it without thinking about it. And at the molecular level, life has always worked with the quantum domain. It has always been attuned to a different order reality, even if we didn't see it, which is why it is essential that the most useful tool to pursuing any field in which there are major knowledge gaps is an open mind. Okay, and I'm just going to leave you with dish brain. These are human and mouse brain cells that have learned to play an old video game. I don't know how. I can't read the graphic because I'm not a computational biologist. But here is the story in Neuron about in vitro neurons learning and exhibiting, they say sentience, but it's not sentience by really anybody else's measure, when embodied in a simulated game world. And now, of course, in Australia, there is a new startup that is focused on building a body in a box to support that gray matter and send it out into the world. And with this, I remind you of the take home. Life isn't possible without processes traditionally considered cognitive. This is not a surprise. These are points that have been made before by others. And this is important because this is the only way we'll really truly understand the ways in which we are different cognitively. And so I thank you very much for listening to me rabbit on in a very loud voice, which sounds very American and might even be offensive to some ears. Sometimes it's offensive to me. And I need to thank the ghosts in my machine. Matt is sitting here and he's visible, but Fred, Mike, Ava, Audrey, Bill, Ken, and Nick are all part of my tribe, but the head of the clan is Richard Bradshaw, without whose enduring support and unflagging encouragement, I would not be able to do this work. Thank you very much.